Welcome to 2018 Lessons from the Long Paddock, our second year of Lessons from the Long Paddock from the Diocese of Wilcannia-Forbes. And thank you for coming along, and thank you for tuning into our website, if that's how you found us this morning or this afternoon or whatever time of day it is for you. Before we begin, we're here in North Sydney, so we'll start with an acknowledgement of country. Today we acknowledge and pay our respects to the First Peoples, traditional custodians of the lands and waterways of the Camaragal people. We acknowledge and celebrate the continuation of a living culture that has a unique role in this region. We acknowledge elders past and present, as well as emerging leaders of today. And we express our gratitude to them for their wisdom and guidance, and we do our best to respect their land. We might begin with a prayer this morning as well, a brief one. I asked Bishop Columba just a moment ago whether it was a good idea, and I had in my mind that big part of Lessons from the Long Paddock is to grow the confidence of lay people around the country to lead in their own communities. So rather than ask him or the priests or sisters present to start with a prayer, I thought I might do that myself so that we lay people have a sense of our capacity to do this at times when perhaps it's needed and we're not feeling as confident as we might. So we begin in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, we pray that your Spirit be with us this morning, that your Spirit be with all those people who tune in to Lessons from the Long Paddock and are curious about their own spiritual lives, about this unique country that we live in, and about our very precious Catholic tradition. May we be nurtured to feel confident in who we are and our sense of belonging here, and may we grow in confidence to welcome others into our story and share with all those we meet a sense of the hope that comes from our own magnificent tradition. We ask this prayer in the name of Jesus, your Son, and the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. This morning we start with our first story. You'll remember from last year, and if you look at last year's story on the website, you'll see that we've got 4 stories in 2017 that continue to be there, and this year 4 more stories. And clicking under those stories, you'll see that there are resources for you to use, resources that will help you to unpack conversations and to encourage people to be a part of a broad conversation around what it means to have an authentic spiritual life, what it means to be a human being wherever you are in this country and perhaps even overseas, and what it means to be engaging with our faith as lay people in particular. So just follow the instructions basically on the website as to how to access those resources. The whole experience takes about 3 hours. You can stop and start at any time. You don't have to sit down and do the whole thing together. You can do an hour at one sitting, come back tomorrow, come back in a week, come back in a month and do the next story, or you can do it all at once. It doesn't matter. It's up to you how you engage with this resource that we hope you'll enjoy. You may have noticed, and you'll be half asleep if you haven't noticed, in the news in the last weeks, there's a serious drought happening out in the Diocese of Wilcannia-Forbes and other places around in the country in Australia. And like everybody else in those drought-stricken places, we're pretty desperate and needing support. So with that in mind, I really ask for you to, at the end of your watching and participating with Lessons of the Long Paddock, go to the bell at the bottom of the home page on our Wilcannia-Forbes Diocese website. Hit that bell and you'll find, or if you don't hit that bell, there's a little click below it which says donate here, and please donate here. That would be terrific. This is a free offering. It's our gift to whoever would like to engage with it, but we would really appreciate if you could help us out with some funds if you can. A big part of what we want to do is to support our resources to finance another lay minister. We've got one lay minister. Mary Ann Gordon will be with us here in North Sydney shortly. She's probably stuck in traffic, I imagine, but she's our only lay minister. She was on ABC Compass a couple of weeks ago. No doubt you saw that wonderful story. We would like to have her cloned 2 or 3 times if we can, and perhaps a man or 2 in there as well, so that we can actually engage with people who are isolated, especially farmers at the moment who are doing it really tough. To have someone like Mary Ann get in a ute and turn up at their station and support Bishop and the priests in our diocese to help them would be extraordinary. And it will go on after the drought. So it's an intense need at the moment, but the need doesn't go away when the rain comes. So please remember to wonder about how you can help. And on our website as well, you'll find a link to lay ministry and how to support that. So please do have a look. I'll ask those here present to make sure your phones are turned off. Doesn't matter if you're anywhere else, because it won't matter, but here it will matter with the sound recording, so please make sure your phones are off. And with no further ado, I'll begin in a moment with viewing the Wally and Margie story, and then we'll go to Father Richard Leonard, SJ, who will have some words to say about what he's picked up in all of the stories perhaps, but particularly perhaps this morning in the Wally and Margie story. And you can, as viewers, flick to any of those stories at any time and come back and hear Richard's speech presentation before, after, during, it doesn't matter. Here in our little venue, we'll do it in a sequential way, but you don't have to at home. So we'll start with that. We'll have morning tea break and then another video or 2, and then Sister Michelle Connolly, and then our own Bishop Columba Macbeth Green. So we'll hope the button works on our story of Margie and Wally from out in Louth, which is northwest of Bourke.
Yes, I'm Wally Mitchell. We, the family, have lived here in this area for a lot of years, quite some generations, and we dearly love it. We do get involved in other areas, other activities, and you see different ways of living and doing things, but we keep reverting back here. It's not just home, it's a way of life, and the people in it are so closely integrated in the support they give to one another that this tiny village where we live, nobody locks their houses. They have this total trust, and if strangers or people who might seem challenging or unusual come through, there's this sense of bonding protection from the whole area, and it's never spoken. Nobody mentions, but that's just the way they live. Yes, it's very dry. That's the story at the moment, but it's just a moderate-sized property for these areas, and we run merino wool-cutting sheep and polled Hereford cattle. Yeah, you get dealt a different hand now and again, and I don't know that there's any favouritism. We all take a flogging occasionally. Yes, I think that looking back at it, we're very fortunate to live in this Western Division. It's a different type of pastoral operation, and you inevitably occasionally go broke. Markets that you can't influence change, and weather here is such that we're prone to drought, and they can be very prolonged, and no matter how careful you are with stock and your resources and maybe build up some wealth to buy fodder, that can all come to an end on time. If a drought runs long enough, it shuts us all down. It's unavoidable, but we choose to live here because our families have made it a successful way of life in the broad term. It's a way of life that I wouldn't share, wouldn't swap, I wouldn't trade with anybody, and yet we know the costs of it. Being prepared is only part of it, but being able to wear a good flogging when you get it is the other half. Yeah. Your plans are locked on to things you must do, and you're controlled by strange things. You're controlled by water, particularly. Like today, it was all planned I'd have the day here with you, but I've had a fence break from a little storm of only a short patch of country that got wet and ran water through a fence and knocked it down, and then stock have gone through that into an area of some 40,000 acres where there's no water. So I have to get them back. The wind today is helping, and the stock that I'm after are coming into that wind as they do, and they're making back towards where they know I have water for them. Yeah, it's magic. You can't stop it in a big season, so you look after it. You don't give it a hard time. You then try to accumulate a bit more money to do further improvements. There's always something to be done. Your fencing and things like that. Like properties here have over hundreds of miles of fencing on each property, and yards and sheds and tanks and water and bores and things. And these all need maintaining and replacing, and it's only a matter of you living for the land, living to keep it in such a condition it can continue to keep us. And I say us as the family and the broader family, and a degree of stability. Wealth isn't the right word for it, because wealth can be eroded very rapidly, but it's got to have stability. Otherwise you couldn't live in this country.
It's a lovely lifestyle because you can please yourself, what you do. If you don't want to see anyone, you don't have to. You don't have to talk to anyone if you don't want to. And a very different life. And you have none of those commitments that the city people have to catch, their buses, their trains, their trams, but we don't have any of that, and we've got the wide open spaces. My married life with Wally, I told him the other day only that he did 38 years in local government. So the children saw a picture of the wall, and that was their father, and and I said, it must be nearly time that I started to do what I want to do. But the whole trouble is, I'm too old now to do what I probably wanted to do, and oh no, I guess it's not all give and take, but there's a lot of it, and it's not all yes dear, no dear, 3 bags full. Because if you didn't have your say, you'd be very much the underdog in the family. So have your say and make sure, he knows you're there and you've got your opinion of things. Now I can see him coming.
I've been fortunate enough to have to travel into other countries I was representing Australian local government into places like Canada and China and US and Britain, and those trips are brief, but they give you a snapshot of people and lifestyles. But there are no real comparisons because the life is only your own, and other people can't fully share that or influence it much either. You don't choose your faith and you don't choose to be alone. It's just circumstance. But you have a lot of time to think and to rethink and to dread the decision you've made in peace. It's different. There's a lot of quiet time. A lot of the hours of the day you're on your own, and that's different to most ways of life, where people not only mix with others, but they depend on others. But here, the dependency is very much on your own, and you have to depend on yourself and your close family. What is involved in a simple trip to church? Instead of a walk down the street or whatever, it might be up before daylight to be prepared and leave things looked after on the place while you're away for a full day or even more, and then travelling 100 k's or more to get to church. Yeah, well, their faith is the thing that their parents have given them, and in many cases, it's in difficult times, it's the only thing that they can give them. And then they realise that they've planted a life that will develop and grow and be beneficial and gainful, because without faith here, often there's nothing else. There's nothing else. When your stock are dying around you and your bank man doesn't want to know you or does want to know you, things can be very, very hard. And often I believe in the faith of these families have kept them out here and given them a reason to continue what they're doing, and then to find, when you get rain or a change in markets or seasons, an achievement. You've survived. The achievement of surviving is difficult to count in dollars, but it stands up forever. It's there because your family have lived on in the area with the same values, and this is where their faith is a basic part of that. Whether it be Catholic or Presbyterian or whatever, their Christian faith is a very large part of their survival in the backcountry. Well, the fact of a priest being in the area is a tremendously important part, although you may not recognise day by day that the instances that we depend on, the major illness, a person dying, the chance of getting to Mass and Communion, getting to the sacraments is an important part, but just the communication with a person of faith and the confidence in them and the lifestyle that they have encouraged in the area is a very valuable part of the whole community, because you may have a very devout person who lives at a high standard, and another bloke who enjoys a few beers but also has very high honesty and good to deal with, and they're both of great value. And the fact that they can live in these communities and appreciate one another brings the fact of faith through even more strongly. And all of these families originally somewhere had deep faith, or they wouldn't have survived out here. I was mayor at the time, I guess, and welcomed Mother Teresa off the aircraft with her little cohorts, and the most impressive thing about them when they arrived was that they had all of their possessions in an enamel bucket each, and that was it. And that told us quite simply that they were very genuine, a lifestyle that was totally away from the general trend, and luxuries and things didn't matter to them at all. They didn't need to communicate in the things that didn't matter to them. They didn't have fashion, they didn't have stories, they just had a job to do. They were excellent, and they were happy. They were incredibly happy ladies. Well, it was originally a Presbyterian church in Byrock, Churches get about a bit out here because that one, the railway line was being built to Bourke, and when that was completed, the big numbers of people living at Byrock would have dissipated. So it belonged to the Presbyterian folk, and they moved it here to Louth, where they must have believed they had a stronger calling. And it was used by all faiths, and I can remember when I was going to school here, the Salvation Army girls used to come and liven the cobwebs in it every now and again. And eventually, like a lot of the Presbyterian churches, it was being put up for sale. So Margie and I decided to buy it, and the rest of the Catholic community all contributed, so we all own the little church. And now I think our local Chamber of Commerce have taken it over or whatever. It's quite unique. It seems to me the only church that has rates on it at the moment, although they say it's water rates, but we'll work that out. Yeah, we'll work that out. We develop a respect for God because even if he forgets to rain, he can wipe us out. Or if he forgets some of the issues that are important to us, we suffer. But so we've got to realise that we're in his care, and we hope he cares.
Just before I ask Father Richard to come and share some insights that he has, having watched the story of Wally and Margie, I'll just ask those of you, wherever you might be, to trust your own gut feelings and have a bit of a conversation in your own little communities and gatherings wherever you might be. What did you hear? What made your heart beat a little faster, or what brought a tear to your eye, or what was a curiosity for you? Ask yourselves what you heard and then share that with the people that you're with before you listen to any of our presenters.
These beautifully produced films are not just portraits of 5 great Australians, but they're profiles of faith and they're meditations on the daily living of Christianity. It comes as no surprise that one of the big themes to emerge from 3 of these 4 stories is water, the river, and rain. Wally talks about how the weather can give farmers a flogging. Jonathan is proudly a riverman and tells us that water is where his mob go to find life and to share life. And Jason makes an even more explicit link between the river, the sacrament of baptism, and helping others in and through Christ. Given the heartbreaking drought the entire country is experiencing right now, and that the Wilcannia Forbes Diocese knows more about that than most others, I want to reflect on what a precious gift water is. A few years ago, I wrote a book called Where the Hell is God? Finding God in Pain and Suffering. And I called chapter 3 in that book, And Now Let's Cross to God the Weatherman. Can we stop praying for rain, please? I'm on very thin ice right now. That in a desert diocese, in the middle of a drought, when we've been praying for rain for generations, I'm theologically going to encourage you not to do so. You see, I'm asked to pray about the weather an awful lot. I've lost count of the number of brides who've asked me to pray for a fine day for their wedding. And now I say, no, I will not do that. Whatever's happening outside the church, it'll be raining love in the church, which is slightly nauseating. But in Australia, we are again living through a very long drought. It's heartbreaking to see rivers dry up, cattle and sheep needing to be slaughtered, and people walking off their farms and their families have run for generations. We know the suicide rate increases during droughts, as does the divorce rate. And as people leave the area for work, small towns and communities are dislocated, and some actually are in danger of dying. Evil's a big word to describe the fallout from drought, but only a person who has never directly been touched of it would think of it in any less dramatic terms. My problem is with droughts is often the response of religious people, like priests and bishops and religious and others and good lay people, is that in almost every church and community in Australia, we start praying for rain. And on one level, this is entirely appropriate, stating, as it symbolically does, that God wants to enter into every part of our lives and stands in solidarity with us in our joys and hopes, our griefs and anxieties. Even in a drought, God wants us to name what our needs are, and these occasions are cries of the heart, from the heart. They can be occasions for what I would prefer to think of as a liturgical lament, lamentation, a collective expression of communal pain. My worry arises when they are rarely couched in those terms at all, and they seem to raise more questions about God's love and care of us, and whether God even cares that it's not raining right now. Just for the record, I do not believe that God directly, very important word, directly wills or sends earthquakes, floods, droughts, or other natural disasters. I think it may be the Earth's climate in a long-term cyclical pattern which we've not had the tools to measure until recently, and nor the records to read. It could be because of solar flares over which we have absolutely no control. It might also be that in some of our countries we've populated the wrong areas, we've grown the wrong crops, and we've not been good stewards of the earth locally and globally. The worst case scenario is that it's a combination of every one of these factors. We're still learning and growing in regard to the earth. In any case, we now know that the earth is much more fragile than we thought, and it's more balanced and finely tuned than we've ever appreciated, maybe excepting our Indigenous brothers and sisters who have understood it perfectly for 60,000 years. The earth is evolving all the time, now literally groaning in an act of giving birth, as St. Paul said. It is so much more precarious than we've ever believed. We know we need to treat it with care. And what do we think when we get a drought? My worry is often we have an image of God sitting in heaven when we're praying for rain, and God's sitting there saying, "No, I will not send rain, so go away, dry up and die," as though God won't open those famous windows in the globe that the ancient people of the Bible thought were there. Surely not. I can't understand or believe or love a God who would see the heartbreak of people walking away from their life, from their family, from their community, from their land. So I do accept that while we might gather for a Mass where we ask God to make us strong in the face of drought and liturgically cry out in pain, I think we should be careful about praying for rain as we've traditionally accepted it. And I want to get clear that along with Pope Francis, I think we can and should pray about water, about the earth and the environment. I think they're two completely different moments. I think if we, as Pope Francis recently said in Laudato Si', if we are truly pro-life, it's inescapable that we have to be pro-planet as well. And even the Catholic Missal has masses for all sorts of desperate occasions. And I think these can easily be reclaimed as part of our liturgical lament as we cry out in our need to the same God who's already present to us, aware of our need, weeping with us and accompanying us through the driest times in our life. The psalmists were onto something very powerful in this regard when over half the psalms are lamentations, cries of the heart. But this raises another vital point. What do we think when we have petitionary prayer, where we ask for God to do something? Does prayer change God or change us, or change both. My problem is some people's image of God is God's a bit of a magician who's up on the stage about to do another amazing trick, like break the drought, or like heal my brother, or something else that we earnestly and passionately want. And sometimes we're not chosen from the audience for that to occur. But prayer doesn't change God. We've never believed that prayer changes God, because we say God is immutable, a technical, jargon, theological word that simply says God is unchanging. For as the Apostle James says in chapter 1, every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change as the shifting shadows. I want to get really clear. I believe prayer, penance, and fasting really matter. But they don't change God. They change me. They change us to go and change the world. And while I think we should not ask God to send rain, I certainly think we should be on our knees morning, noon, and night with fasting and penance and lament over bad behaviour for not treating water as the gift it is from God's hands. So I think we should pray this prayer. Dear God, in this parched land, we know how precious the gift of water really is. Make us mindful of how we waste water. Help us to conserve it for the drought that we have with us now and will return again one day. And may we have enough water not only for our needs, but to share our water with those who have nothing to drink most of the time. Lord, hear us. Lord, hear our prayer, asking an unchanging God to change me, to change us, to change the world. The second theme that struck me from these wonderful film clips was, and it came as a surprise, but maybe it shouldn't have, all four stories bring together two of the greatest schools of prayer in our Catholic tradition: desert spirituality and the Benedictine tradition. From the 3rd to the 5th centuries, people left towns and cities and moved into the harsh deserts to pray. Initially, St. Anthony and his earliest companions were hermits, and your own bishop of this diocese continues in that hermitage tradition and his order back to the 13th century to this day. But communities developed around Anthony's and companions, and a common way of life emerged, and a common prayer emerged as well. It was the beginning of what we now call monastic life. And when we look at how the desert is used in the Bible, the journey to the desert, in our case to the bush, is filled with a mixture of pleasure and pain, abundant with revelation, transformation, and recreation. And as we find in Jesus' example in the desert, we don't have to give in to the temptations in the desert and see it only as loss and despair, but it can be a path to being recreated, to being richer for the experience of having lived there, of being there. These four stories of people who live in the bush teach all of us sometimes we need to venture with Christ into the desert, and occasionally we need to do it physically, if we can, to separate ourselves for a while so we might be more humble. Knowing the word humble comes from the Hebrew word humus, from which we get a rather delicious dip as well, which means we're rooted to the ground. We're connected to the land, right here, right now. It also means we become not frightened of the Lord, in fear of the Lord, but respectful of the Lord, where our desires are purified, and where we might get free of the individualism that so starks our society right now and become more communitarian. We need each other. And finally, I think the desert might hold some self-knowledge, for these four films are replete with people who have extraordinary insight into their own lives. And I think there's a call to live more simply. Put in one sentence, if we allow the bush to do anything, it can draw us closer to God. And although it bears his name, St. Benedict actually didn't found the Benedictine order. He and his sister Scholastica both founded monasteries and a convent respectively, But Benedict wrote a rule for the community, and it's one of the most ancient and important guides to living the Christian life that we have. And the rule's breakup of the day is into periods of the day for liturgy, community life, meals, reading and study, and manual work, so that the monk or nun could come closer to God through each of these, held in balance. Benedict understood that without structure, some of us go adrift. The rigour of Benedictine monasteries was not easy, but Benedict's rule is also marked by a gentle tone and deep compassion. He discovered through trial and error that silence in the day was as important as conversation, that prayer and work and learning were essential, as was staying put, and everyone had to contribute to the best of their abilities and gifts. He was also into consultative government long before it was fashionable. And the opening line of St. Benedict's rule is one word: listen. Obidare in Latin. Firstly and foremost, Benedict calls us to listen to God. Not the abbot, not the community, not the church, not even the rule, but to listen to what God is saying through our experience of his life in our daily existence. And this matters. These films are testimony to people that have found a structure, have found a rhythm, and even out of the most bitter experiences have learnt an insight into the very heart of God. You see, true spirituality is not about keeping rules and laws. It's about discernment of what God is leading us, me, ever deeper into his love. Possum, Jason, Jonathan and Wally and Margie are all Benedictine in the most extraordinary way imaginable. They're contemplatives in action. Their prayer affects their lives. They talk about it quite openly. They value the structures that are built up around their day, which enables them to serve their community. And the rhythms of life and the seasons of the earth connect them, keep them humble, rooted to the land, to their home, and they're bonded to others in love. Joan Chittister, a Benedictine nun, in her wonderful book, The Rule of Benedict, Insights for the Ages, says this: Benedictine spirituality sees the care of the earth and the integration of prayer and work, body and soul, as essential parts of the journey to wholeness that answers the emptiness in each of us. Rather than looking at the desert or the bush as empty, these four magnificent believers tell us how full it actually can be. The third and final thing that struck me was that in every single presentation we hear about the importance of women, religious women, the sisters, and how sad the locals are that they're not there anymore. There are just over 4,000 religious sisters in Australia today. The average age is 74. We are one flu away from not knowing a life as we've known it before. That breaks my heart, because my own story of religious women is I wouldn't be a Jesuit priest now if it wasn't for the love and care of religious women. There are 16 sisters I discovered still living in the diocese. And we would not have the Catholic community we have in this country, especially in education, healthcare and social services, if it wasn't for the extraordinary witness and sheer hard work and courage of religious women, of sisters, who in black serge and brown habits was in 45 degrees wearing something that kept women in European Chile monasteries warm. And underneath all of that, they broke out in heat rash. There was real suffering for these women in the bush. And thank God they're still being thanked and celebrated. And through them, I also want to celebrate women in general in the church. Women make up 75% of the workforce of the Catholic Church in Australia today. Of the 221,000 employees in the church, 165,750 are women. 75% of all teachers, 45% of all school principals are women. And while we don't have women priests in the Catholic Church, that doesn't mean we don't have women leaders. We could not run, even to this day, Catholic education, healthcare and welfare, aged care, without the leadership of women. In fact, I think the women in the Catholic Church of Australia should go on strike for a week just to remind the men who's running this show. And even on the ground, in the backbone of almost every parish in the city and the bush, we find our women. There are 662,000 Catholics who are still going to Mass every Sunday. That's 12.2% of the 5.4 million of us. And over 60% of them are women. And Margie gives great voice to the strength of Catholic rural women. She wasn't to be oppressed by her husband. She's a partner. And now she's looking for her opportunity to find something that she wants to do. More power to you. But in the Wilcannia Forbes diocese, there have been at least three outstanding groups of religious women who have given great service to the people of God in the bush: the Mercies, the Josephites, and the Missionaries of Charity. The Mercies began their work in Cobar in 1884. The Josephites began their work at Hillston in 1892, and the Missionaries of Charity began their work at Burke in 1969. I want to think about the three foundresses, because they've got something to tell us right now. The Venerable Catherine Macaulay, who died in 1841, the foundress of the Sisters of Mercy, was an orphan by the age of 20. She lived with two Protestant families then for the next 24 years. This was scandalous in Catholic Ireland in its day. Mind you, she did end up converting most of them, but that's another story. And then, having inherited a fortune at 44 from her uncle, rather than live the life of an heiress, Catherine wanted to do something for the poor women and children of Dublin and began the Mercies in 1827. The first Mercies came to Australia in 1846. And today, worldwide, there are 9,000 religious Sisters of Mercy working for the poor and needy in education, healthcare, social services, spirituality, pastoral care, and in advocacy for women, children, and refugees. Whatever else Catherine Macaulay instilled in her sisters, courage and compassion are among their greatest attributes. Before she died, it's recorded that Catherine Macaulay's last words on this earth were, "Make sure the sisters have a comfortable cup of tea." And then she died. By invoking that ritual, tea making, tea sharing, which the Irish have made their own, she revealed a couple of things: a faith that is practical, comforting, domestic, hospitable, sustaining, and hardworking. As somebody who went to our family properties in the bush, from Billy tea to high tea at the Ritz in London, I think tea is just like the best of religious faith. It can be dressed up or dressed down, depending on the occasion in the city or the bush. But it's a ritual that meets us where we're at. Thank God for Catherine Macaulay. St. Mary MacKillop, who died in 1909, gives comfort to every sane religious prophet, rebellious prophet in the church and the world. After being excommunicated on the 22nd of September 1871, most Australians don't know that Mary had to set out protecting her work and her sisters from some pretty terrible bishops in this country. She's canonised, they're not. There's a lesson in there for everyone. And Mary MacKillop was actually aided and abetted through an unlikely conspiracy, I'm not making this up, between a Jew, a Presbyterian, and a Jesuit. That sounds like the beginning to a joke. But one of Mary's greatest friends and patrons was Mrs. Joanna Barr Smith, a devout Presbyterian who never converted to Catholicism, who helped Mary finance her early foundation and paid for her tombstone when she died. Her other friend was Emmanuel Solomon, a Jewish man who was transported to Australia as a convict for theft in 1880, but he came good and later became an extremely successful businessman in South Australia and a parliamentarian in that state too. And these two wealthy people in Adelaide paid for Mary's trip to Rome and for the year she spent roaming around Europe waiting for her order to be approved. Mary MacKillop was one of the original Australian backpackers. And it was Father Joseph Tupina, SJ, a Jesuit brother of mine who was her spiritual director. He didn't have any money to help her, but he had the contacts, and he paved the way for her eventually to get in to see Pope Pius IX. There is only one other saint in the Catholic Church that I know of who has gone from excommunication to canonisation. Joan of Arc took 489 years and we burnt her at the stake. We apologised in 1924. That was big of us. Mary took 139 years to take the same journey. Mary MacKillop is an outstanding Christian who refused to be mastered by her religious masters. An ecumenist, she was into interreligious dialogue when it was held in the deepest of suspicion. She knew that the best way to tear down sectarianism and religious bigotry was just to become friends with your neighbours. And she was a teacher who believed that education remains one of the best paths to human and spiritual liberation. She was a passionate advocate, and she had to learn how to use her networks to win the battle and the war. Finally, St. Teresa of Calcutta, who died in 1997, was a woman who knew what it was to be like to be pushed from pillar to post. Born into the Ottoman Empire, in her lifetime she became by turn Serbian, Bulgarian, Yugoslav and Indian. And if she returned to her birthplace right now, she'd find out that her family would be Macedonian. This is a woman who might have stayed in the same place initially, but the ground shifted under her feet. Things change. She became a Loreto sister in 1929 and left immediately to become a missionary in India. In 1950, the Missionaries of Charity were officially founded, and in the early days, she had an unshakable sense that God was with her in caring for the poorest of the poor. We know, however, in 2007 from a book that was published, Mother Teresa, Come Be My Light, which consisted of her spiritual journals and letters, we now know that from 1957 until her death, she was in a spiritual desert, hoping for some sign, any sign of God's presence and love. She wrote at one stage in 1959, "In my soul, I just feel the terrible pain of loss, of God not wanting me, of God not being God, of God not even existing." No one could ever have guessed that in the way she conducted her life in public, of the confidence she kept going with, but this was blind faith. In this context, what's extraordinary is, like the people of the bush, she just kept going, doing her work for the poor in the hope that it was pleasing to God, and sending her sisters to do the same to the people at the back of Burke. All three women, I think, are magnificent models for every woman and man in the church right now. Because if we're going to become companions with those who are on the fringe of society and those who live on the edge of the deserts, we're going to have to deal with the fact that life was never promised to us to be easy, and including the life of faith. But through accompanying the poor, hanging there where the going gets tough, and building relationships with all of those who share our vision and values, but maybe not even our faith, means that from what I can tell from these stories from the long paddock, the baton has been passed from the sisters they so admired and so longed to see, even for a return, no doubt, to 4 contemporary disciples. And the good news is that in the way they speak and live their lives right now in the Wilcannia-Forbes diocese, the good news is in good hands. The rain may not be falling, but the rivers of new life that come from Christian baptism are flowing in abundance. So, given the Irish foundation and heritage of the diocese, I want to close with some ancient Celtic words which connect us again to the earth we need to cherish. May the road rise up to meet you. May the wind be ever at your back. May the sun shine warm upon your face. May the rains fall soft upon your fields. And until we meet again, may God hold you in the hollow of his hand. And until we meet again, may God hold you in the hollow of his hand. Amen.
Wow. Thank you, Father Richard. Thank you so much. We'll take a break wherever you are. If you want to take a break now, if you've had one already, no matter if you've seen 3 videos or just one or half a one because you stopped and started to talk, no matter. We'll take a break here and we'll be back shortly.